Today I'm going to show you how to measure cables for your board so you can get the perfect custom cables every time. Whether you're getting a teamwork setup with Goodwood Audio where we show you how to do the process and help you set up your board, giving you tips and tricks along the way, or you've come across this video and you're just wanting to learn more about doing your own setups, this video is going to show you how to measure out your cables, whether it's patch cables, TRS, MIDI, or power, and how to get it done perfectly every time so that you can get clean cable channels, then make your own cables and install them on your pedal board. So before we really get into too much of the details, I want to go over some of the key points and how you're going to apply these into the examples I'm about to show you. So you can see a pedal board on screen. I'm going to give you practical examples in just a sec, but first let's go over the key principles and how you're going to apply them on this setup later on in this video. So first let's go straight to the desk. A couple of tools you're going to need, let's loosely call them tools. You're going to need some sort of length of cable, even some string could do, or twine. This is going to mimic the path of the cable on your pedal board, and then you're going to measure that length of cable and record it. So you also are going to need something to record the cables on. I have this on screen here, and you can see here this screen mimics our whole signal chain. So the way that I've set this up is we have pedal 1, let's call this a TS9, goes into pedal 2, which is going to be a DS1. And then the signal just keeps going from there. And we are going to measure the distance between the TS9 output and the DS1 input. Then I also have a section here for loopers. If you have a true bypass looper, which requires 2 cables per pedal or per section of pedals, we have a send 1 and return 1, which would stand in this case for loop 1 of the true bypass strip. And then we record the plug types and cable. This brings me to another point, is you really want to understand what plug types you need per pedal. So on screen here, you can see I have a tube screamer, and there are no other jacks around this tube screamer. So you can just use a pancake. But if we were to get something like this TS10, you can see here that we have a power jack right beside the input jack. So a pancake isn't going to work because it'll take up too much space around that power jack. So we're going to use a right angle, or we could have used a mini cake. So basically, if you have tight space around jacks, maybe a stereo pedal or a Boss pedal with stereo outputs, you want to use a right angle or a mini cake. Mini cakes, even on stereo Boss pedals, are too big. So you'll need to use a right angle or short body straights in that instance. On true bypass strips, I would usually recommend using mini cakes, short body straights, because they're really easy to label and keep track of, or sometimes even right angles, and you just need to find the best plug for your specific scenario. Obviously, if you get lost, just ask us, because we've worked with the majority of these things and we'll know what plugs will work best. Something like an RJM PBC6X or a Gig Rig G3 or even a Boss ES8, if you have the space, just use short body straights. If you have a stereo Boss pedal, which are super tight, use right angles. And then all other mono pedals, use pancakes, stereo Strymons, mini cakes, or right angles, and you get kind of a feel for what kind of space you have to work with. But choosing the right plug types and recording them on your cable sheet are very important, because you don't want to get the right cable length, but then the cables don't fit in the pedals you're trying to route them to. Okay, so we have our length of cable to measure cables with. We also need something to measure each distance with. So I have a measuring tape. If you're doing mostly short cables, you could use a ruler. And then we can get into these examples. So first thing we're going to do, the easiest example is 2 pedals that are side by side. We need to route the output jack of pedal 1 to the input jack of pedal 2. Now, you may think the easiest way to do this is just to line the end of the cable up to where they're going to need to be soldered inside of the plug, which on this pancake is right in the middle of the circle there, and then run as short a cable as possible to the input jack of the next. So now let's check out our measuring tape. We have a cable that'll need to be 4¼ inches long. This, in theory, can work, and you will get a working cable. You'll be able to bridge the distance between the two pedals. But what happens if you move from a side-mounted jack to a top-mounted jack? Well, now your cable isn't going to fit. So what I like to do is I like to future-proof. What I mean by that, something called, well, what I call looping. And this is basically where you can point one jack, in this specific instance, one jack would go down, the other jack would point up, and this forces you to run the cable away from jack 1, because it needs to exit the plug. Then you loop it, go past the input jack of jack 2, and loop that back around. So just so you can see it on screen here, we are looping these cables away from jack 1, past jack 2, and now we have a length. Instead of 4 1/4, we're at 9 1/2. And so you might be thinking, man, all this extra cable, it's going to hurt my tone. I'm going to sound like I'm playing, my amp is under a blanket, all the highs are going to be rolled off. Absolutely not. If you have a buffered signal, any pedal that is turned on, buffers running at the input of your pedal board, the output of your pedal board, you will have buffers in your chain. An extra few inches per cable is not going to make a big difference, but it will allow you to future-proof your rig and swap out pedals so much easier than if you do the shortest possible distance for every cable. So now we are going to record the length of this cable, just over 9 inches, and the plug type for each pedal. So we have the pancake for the output of the TS-808 and a pancake for the input of the DS1. This is the most basic way you can measure cables, but the principle applies to just about everything. Loop your cables so you have slack built in. At the very least, loop it on one side of the cable so you have an extra couple of inches just in case you swap out for a pedal that has different jack placement. Then you don't have to replace the cable, rerun the cable channel, so on and so forth. So you can loop with MIDI cables, you can loop with DC cables, TRS, insert, obviously patch cables. Think ahead when it comes to this approach and you will be very glad that you did. Just to show you really practically how you might loop a DC cable, one side is going to be coming from the power supply and then eventually you're going to make it to the pedal. So instead of just going to the pedal and then running down to the power supply in the shortest distance possible, looping for this would look like going past the pedal jack you need to go to and then loop back around. Now again, if you need to go to a side-mounted power tap, then this will still work because you'll have that extra slack. So, and you can decide how much extra slack you want to give. In this instance, you might want a little bit more than to the edge of the pedal. So we might just go past it like this. And you could even tuck it underneath if the dual lock allows it. But now we can make it to the halfway point on the pedal, no problem. So that's how you would loop DC. Another common question I get is how do I route cables when a riser is involved? Maybe a hinged riser specifically, which are even more difficult. The main thing you want to do here is mimic the motion of the riser while the cable is in place. So what I would do here, let's say I'm going from the output jack of the DS1, I'm going to do my normal looping. So I'll go out of the jack, loop back around, and I'll just put my finger down here. And general rule of thumb is you kind of want to go up into a riser on one of the sides, or you could obviously go up the middle. But what you want to do is figure out ways, again, to leave slack. So how I like to do this, staying away from hinges or things that can pinch, is I like to run the cable up to the riser and then go sideways a little bit before I put my first anchor. So now when the riser comes down, let's see if we can mimic this up here. When the riser comes down, the cable has movement or slack to actually flex. Whereas if I would have gone straight up to the riser and instantly put an anchor down, it would probably still work, but you have less movement and less play. This becomes more important as you put more and more cables in one channel going up to the riser. You want to have a little bend in the cable and then anchor it down to that riser rather than doing a little short distance and anchoring right on the bottom of the pedal board and anchoring right on the riser as soon as you possibly can. Try and add in a little curve to do that. And again, practically, another option to get up here is you might be running a cable channel up the top of the riser here, and then you could loop the cable around to get up to the riser and anchor right up there on the flat section that my thumb is on the underside of that lid. Then you can go up to the top of the riser after you've anchored to get to your pedals. The biggest rule of thumb for risers, and especially hinged risers, is making sure that you are not trying to go, again, the shortest possible distance. You want to leave room for that cable to flex and move as the riser opens and closes. One other important thing that you want to take note of when you're measuring cables is to not cut corners. This is both important in life, but also when you're measuring cables. So if I was coming down a cable channel down this way and I needed to get to the DS1, what I am not going to do is run the cable channel and then try and cut corners to get to that jack. And you may think this is so obvious, why would anyone ever do that? But if you aren't purposeful, it happens without you even realizing it. So maybe you're kind of just measuring and then you're going up, trying to loop around, and the cable itself just moves and decreases the overall length. So what I like to do here is very purposefully run my cable channel. I'll put my thumb down at the corner, and then I will run my cable and then loop around to the jack, and that gives me my length. So especially on corners, try and do the same 90-degree corner every time you do it, and you'll get a really quick feel for how you need to measure those, where your thumb needs to go to make sure that corner happens, and you get the correct overall length. So again, so far to review, we're looping every cable. We are not trying to find the shortest distance, but allowing the cables to move when it comes to risers. And this even applies not going the shortest distance for cutting corners, which we just went over, making sure that your cables are actually going to take the real path. When you get the final cable in hand, the path that you took when you measured is the path that you'll actually be taking when you have the physical cable anchored to your board. And lastly, some of the tricks you're going to want to know when you're using an angled pedal board. Oftentimes you're going to want to go from the bottom of the pedal board, since you can run things underneath an angled board, up to the top to where the pedals need to be. This is quite similar to using a riser actually, and you want to take some of the same notes. The main thing that you're going to want to note here is that when you're going from the top to the bottom or the bottom to the top, you don't again want to find just the shortest distance. So if I wanted to run from the top and I wanted to run a cable channel underneath the board between Flint and the Vibe, but underneath, I don't want to just run an angle here and go and run under the pedal board this way. That is too short of a distance, and if you're running multiple cables, where the cable sits on the cable channel, maybe it's the second row or maybe even a third row in one bundle of cables, you're going to quickly run out of room. So what I might practically do instead of taking the shortest distance is I might run that same cable channel and then give myself some extra slack. So I might do a 90-degree turn, and then this piece of cable here is going to turn under the board and have a bit of extra slack to get on top of a cable channel rather than the shortest distance possible. So even now you're thinking about a little bit of extra slack and making sure that you have room or a margin for error if you are measuring and making your cables ahead of time. The same principle always applies. Do not take the shortest distance possible. Always leave a little bit of extra room, and you'll be very glad that you did so. Even if you have an angled pedal board like this, you do not always need to run every single cable underneath the pedal board and then go back up to the top to reach the pedal. So what I mean by that is if I was running the output of this DS1 to the input of the Flint, I don't need to loop my cable on the DS1, go underneath the pedal board at the soonest possible spot, and then come back up to get to the input of the Flint. I could very simply just stay on top of the board on this angled board and then get to the input of the Flint that way. You'll have more accurate cable runs this way, and honestly, it'll be a little bit easier to troubleshoot and build when you get the cables in hand. So what I often do here is I'll run the shorter distance cables on top of the board. I'll run power, which is going to be situated underneath this angled pedal board, and I'll run power from bottom to top because I need to, but all of the shorter cables I'll just keep on top of the board. Any long cable runs I will then run underneath the board to make the most of the distance traveled and make it a little bit more efficient and clean. But overall, you can mix and match to make sure that your board is easy to build, easy to troubleshoot, and you aren't making it more complicated than you need to. Keep it simple if you can. This brings up my last point, which is cable channels. It's one thing to make a note in your mind while you're measuring, oh, the DS1 is going from the output to the flint. I'm gonna run that along the top of both pedals and stay on top of the pedal board. But if you haven't left yourself notes to do that, so that maybe a week later you're done building your cables and installing them, you aren't gonna remember every single place that you routed that cable. This isn't the end of the world. As you know, the cable is long enough to make it to its destination. But if you can have just some clear instructions for yourself that are easy to follow, it'll make building the board much easier and reduce the questions that you have for yourself. So if we go back to the screen, you can see that I have a little notes and extras section here. And this is where you can give yourself little hints as to how you routed the cable. So if it was for the flint from the DS1, you might say stay on top of the board in front of DS1 and flint. And that gives you a really good idea of what you're doing there for the routing. Another thing I like to do is I also like to just give myself a few main cable channels. So on this board, cable channel 1, if we're going from right to left, just like we were following in the signal chain, I've already planned out this board and where the cables are going to go. I have one main cable channel that is going to go from top to bottom underneath the board on the right. I'm going to have a main cable channel in the middle of the board underneath. And lastly, a third main cable channel on the left underneath the board. Cable channel 1, 2, and 3. So if I've mapped this out in a very simple drawing, I could just say this cable goes down cable channel 1. So I know that I need to route it under the board on the right-hand side. These cables go down cable channel 2. They're under the board going horizontal underneath the board. And then lastly, these cables go down cable channel 3 under on the left-hand side. So then I know the main pathway my cables need to take in a shorthand form of writing and note-taking. Makes it much easier if you do these little plans ahead of time. The other thing you can do along the way, if you're measuring a whole batch, is just film yourself and then talk out loud with the notes as you go. So as I'm measuring, I can say DS1 output goes across on the top of the board to the flint input, looping both ends. And then I can, if I ever get stuck, I can quickly rewatch the video and find my notes that I've already spoken out loud while I'm going. A couple little tips and tricks, do whichever one works best for you. I promise you the extra effort is going to be well worth it when you're installing and testing the board later on. As for today, that is it for measuring cables. To review, you want to loop your cables, at least one of the ends. And this goes for DC, MIDI, specialty cables, patch cables. Loop at least one end. Plan out your cable channels so you know the main cable channels on your board, and leave yourself shorthand notes so when you're installing, it's really easy to find if you get lost. Do not cut corners. Don't find the shortest possible distance. Make sure that you leave yourself a little bit of extra slack, whether that's going from the bottom of an angled board to the top or going around a corner on a pedal that is on your layout. And then of course, think of the jacks that you are going to be using. Don't assume everything is a pancake or a short body straight or whatever it might be. Plan the best jack types for the pedals that you're using so you don't run into space issues when you're installing the cables on your pedal board. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys soon.